Thank you. So I'm here, excited to be here in Miami. This is actually my first time in Miami, and this is my first talk that I've given in 2.5 years in person. So I'm excited to be here. And I was gonna have you all do squats like Kent said, but since you already did them, I'm gonna save you from that. Okay, so you can all just be seated the whole time this time. Okay. So I'm here to talk about migrating from Enzyme over to React testing library. And some of you may be wondering, well, why do I have to migrate, right? Is he going to try to pitch me on React testing library? Well, no, that's not actually the case. There's actually other reasons for that. So quickly before, though, I get started into that, I want to let you know that I tweeted out a link to the slides. So some of you like to take pictures of slides or like to feverishly jot down notes, already have a link to that. So if you go to my Twitter account, BenMVP, there's already tweeted out a link to there. Or if you go to my website, benmvp.com, there's a link there. Or if you can read that small bit.ly link at the bottom, the slides are there too. Okay, so you feel free to follow along or have those later for you. Okay, so let's quickly start with the history lesson. So Enzyme really changed the game for testing user interfaces. It came out back in 2015 or so, late 2015, and it allowed us to render our components and test our components without needing a real browser. We could actually just run them in Node and run them in our CI environment. Because before, when we had things like other UIs, we had to run them inside of a headless browser, or a real browser, in fact. So quickly, how many people are using Enzyme right now? A raise of hands. Okay, we got some. Some people don't want to admit that they're still using Enzyme. Okay, that's perfectly fine, perfectly fine. So in general, everything was fine with Enzyme until React 17 came out. And the problem was all of our tests in Enzyme broke when we tried to upgrade to React 17. I'm sure some of you all experienced that. And while React 17 didn't have any external features, new features for us, it was a complete rewrite of the internals because they were setting themselves up for React 18 and beyond. So unfortunately, though, Enzyme relied heavily on the internals of React 17. So the Enzyme adapter broke when we upgraded to React 17. So here is a GitHub issue from about 2 years ago requesting an Enzyme 17 adapter because everything was broken. It's got about 100 or so comments or so, and it's still open. So that official adapter never got created. And without that adapter, even though Enzyme, the API was fine, we could never use Enzyme. So, however, shortly after that was filed, this kind soul decided to make an unofficial React 17 adapter. And the idea was that it was going to be a stopgap until the official adapter was created, a couple of months later. But 2 years later and 24 releases later, it's still in existence. And in fact, it's getting 500,000 downloads every week. So it's basically become the official adapter. Everybody's using it. I'm using it too in some of my Enzyme projects. But when React 18 beta was announced about a year ago or so, he went in and tried to create an 18 adapter, an unofficial 18 adapter, but he quickly realized that it wasn't going to be possible. The amount of change that happened in React 18 would take a whole team basically to create a new Enzyme adapter. And in fact, the Enzyme API itself was going to have to change. So pretty much it wasn't going to happen, right? And then React 18 launched officially this past month. So Enzyme is basically end of life. There's no more future for it moving forward. But luckily, it's not the end of the world because React testing library has entered the chat. Okay, so as Kent mentioned, he created React testing library about 4 years ago because he wanted to have a better user experience around testing, not even knowing that all these things would happen with Enzyme. So it's definitely more popular than Enzyme, if not in downloads, definitely in preference. So React testing library's guiding principles are that we're supposed to test our user interfaces like our users use them. So no testing internals and things like that. And its API is designed to make sure that we do that and don't get into all of the internals. And it works with all newer versions of React as well because it doesn't rely on any of the React internals. So I asked about Enzyme. How many people are using React testing library? Okay, much more people, okay, that's great. But if I add up the number of people using Enzyme and the number of people using React testing library, it wasn't 100%. So it makes me wonder, some of you are writing, you're rolling free, not testing any of your code, I guess. So let me formally introduce myself. Like I said, my name is Ilegbodu. I'm a Christian, a husband, and a father. Here's a picture of my family. We're at our friend's wedding on Saturday. So that's my wife, Rashida. We've been married almost 12 years. The girl in my left arm is our oldest daughter, Simone. She's 8. In the middle is our middle daughter, Avery. She's standing on a chair, but she's only 5 years old. And if any of you all have kids, you understand that it's impossible to get them all to look at the camera at the same exact time. So our son, Asher, he's 3, and he was being 3, I guess. I don't know. And we live in Pittsburgh, California, not Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but Pittsburgh, California. And it's somewhere near San Francisco, about an hour outside of San Francisco. So I'm a Google developer expert and a Microsoft MVP, both in web technologies. And currently, I'm a front-end architect at Stitch Fix. I work on our front-end platform team, so we don't work on any of the end features for Stitch Fix, but we enable all of the feature teams to be able to build amazing user interfaces that they do. So we primarily work on the infrastructure to allow devs to do their work. We maintain our React design system, and right now we're actually building an entirely new web development platform for all the teams, and it's built on top of Next.js. So if you haven't heard of Stitch Fix, we're an online styling platform. I heard Tejas call it styling as a service, which I think is a pretty cool way to put it. So we combine technology and data science and real human stylists in order to take the effort out of you having to figure out what you're going to wear or what clothes you should buy. And we ship it all to you in a box, and then you can pick whatever you like, or you can shop directly. And just a quick plug, we're hiring, so I just want to let you know that. My team is hiring an engineer, and there are other opportunities as well. If you're interested, just come and find me. Cool, and lastly, I'm a huge basketball fan, okay? I love playing basketball, watching the NBA. The Rockets, as here, are my favorite team because I was born in Houston. But since I'm in Miami, I figured I'll give you all some love. And LeBron is my favorite player, so those 4 years I was watching the Heat all the time. And the whole reason I mention this is because all of my examples use basketball, so just to give you a heads up. And I'm actually going to the game 2 tonight, my first playoff game. I'm excited. Yeah, you all should be excited too. You're all gonna stomp on the Hawks. Okay, so enough about me though. Let's get into transitioning from Enzyme to React testing library, okay? Because migrating is not just a search and replace, you actually have to change the way that you test. And I'm gonna be going over some React testing library best practices, so even all of you all who are already using the library, hopefully you'll get some good nuggets out of that as well. So let's look at our first example. So here we have a team page component, and it's rendering 2 text components. Let's say they're from our design system, our component library. So the first one, it takes a name prop, and that's always rendered. And let's say that's the name of the team, and it's being rendered in an H1, let's say. And then we have a location prop, which only is rendered if it's passed in, and that's the location of the team. So let's say Houston, Texas, for instance, or Miami, Florida. And that's body text, so it will be in, let's say, a P tag. Now let's look at the actual tests for this component. And we'll start with how things are rendered in Enzyme versus React testing library. So shallow rendering is super popular with Enzyme, right? It kind of forces true unit testing because we don't have to care how text is implemented. But the goal here is to just verify that the correct props were passed to the text component. So in the first assertion, the text gets the children prop with the name, and we verify that children has the value name. And in the second assertion, we verify that the text component exists because depending on if location exists, it should be rendered. And then that its children has the location value that we passed in the test. So React testing library doesn't have a shallow render equivalent. Its render method is full DOM rendering because RTL wants to push us towards testing, like I said, how the user uses our UI. So the most preferred way is by role. That's the ideal way that you should write a test. So we find the team name element by searching for the heading role here, and then we're able to verify its text content. But we can also search by things by its text content in general. I do that quite often there. So Enzyme also has full DOM rendering, if you didn't know, with the mount function. And personally, this is how I wrote most of my Enzyme tests. I actually didn't really like shallow rendering. And the tests kind of look the same between Enzyme and React testing library, but as I've been mentioning, RTL has this more narrow scope of the type of queries that we can have. So there's no searching by tag name, by class name, by generic HTML attribute, none of that. So just to quickly recap on the rendering, so Enzyme, we had shallow rendering, right, where you only saw the component tree. And then you have full DOM rendering with mounts, where you got all of the HTML. Or there was a third one called static rendering, which I never used, but it gave you the HTML tree there. But with React testing library, it's only render, okay? And not to be confused with Enzyme render, that's a different kind of render. It's more so like mount there. And because of RTL's philosophy, HTML DOM rendering is the only way to go. Okay, so let's look at a different example. Like, what if we want to check that something doesn't exist instead, right? So with Enzyme, the wrapper that we get is kind of like jQuery, and we can use .find to expect if one element is there, no elements are there, multiple elements are there. By contrast, though, React testing library has a different query for each flavor of what we expect. So we've already seen the get by, right? Well, there's also query by text instead of get by text. And they're really similar and actually kind of confusing. At least they've always been confusing to me. But the difference is that when you get with query by, if there are no matches, you get back null instead of an error being thrown. And the benefit of getting back null is that you can then verify if this thing exists or not. So right there, I have to be in the document. So it's easier to verify if something is not present. So just to quickly recap all of the query options in Enzyme, there's basically this one flexible .find, which you can use to search by CSS selector, component reference, the component display name even, so text as a string instead of text as a reference, or by object selector. And React testing library would argue that those last three listed are all implementation details of how it's written. And probably most CSS selectors are implementation details as well. But with RTL, we get 8 different queries. And here they are in priority order. So by role is the best one. It's under the accessible to everyone, meaning that sighted users or those using assistive technologies like screen readers, they can all see or view the web page in this way. And then there's semantic, which are like HTML5 or ARIA specs, like title attributes or alt text, for instance, but your browsers or screen readers view those or show those in different ways. Like, for instance, not all browsers will show the title hover when you hover over it. And then last is the test IDs. It's basically the escape hatch if you're trying to find some container or something that's not viewable. So we could write our enzyme tests like RTL. In fact, once I learned RTL but still had to write enzyme tests, I would start writing them a little bit differently. But some things like get by role or get by text even aren't available. So you just got to move over. Okay, so that was our first example of the two. Things get more interesting, though, when we start talking about async. And to be honest, most of our UIs are asynchronous, so it's important for us to figure this part out. So here we have a championships component, all right? And let's say it's a subsection of that team page. It could be written there, and it'll list out all of the championships that a team has won. So when it initially renders, it renders a loading state because data is null. And then in the use effect, we go and we fetch the data, and then the state is updated because we call set data. And then if there are no championships, if the data is empty, then we'll render out an empty state component, let's say. And then lastly, if there is data, then we'll list it all out. So maybe we list out the year they won, the opponent they beat, the record of the series, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's look at that test. So verifying the loading state is what we've already done, basically. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. That's the initial synchronous render. But it gets tricky when we start trying to figure out what happened after we fetched the data, after the async operation has happened. So with Enzyme, we have to move to mount because shallow rendering doesn't use effect. And let's assume also that we're already mocking the fetch using one of the different various ways you can do that. So let's say we're mocking no results. So now we need to wait until after the fetch is run, after the set data has been called, and then after the empty state has been rendered. So I've linked to a blog post about how you can do this in Enzyme, but basically we have to write this helper called run all promises that will exhaust all of the in progress promises so that afterwards we can assume that the fetch has already gone through. And then we do wrapper.update because the component has updated because it re-rendered. And then lastly, we can assert that the Utah Jazz have never, ever, ever, ever won a championship, okay? So that message specifically is for Tyler McGinnis, okay? So if any of you know him or follow him on Twitter, please feel free to let him know that his team has not won any championships. Unfortunately, though, Kent is caught in the crossfires, but that is specifically for Tyler. And so that's how that works in Enzyme. But if we're looking at React testing library, we gotta take a step back. Like, remember, we're trying to test this as how the user would use it. So how would the user know that the Utah Jazz have never, ever, ever, ever won a championship, right? They would see that no championships found message when they were looking at the Utah Jazz, right? So that's how RTL works. So we have a third style query, not get by, not query by, but find by, which is asynchronous. So it will wait until a certain element that you've requested shows up. So in this case, we have find by text. So it will wait until that text shows up. And then once it has shown up, we'll get the element for that. And then afterwards, we can do whatever tests we want there. So RTL has all of these async methods that help testing asynchronous code a lot easier. And then similarly, if we're trying to validate the UI here, we run all promises in Enzyme again. We do the wrapper.update. We will likely validate that the container exists because it has the data in it, and then verify that we have the correct number of sections of data, right? So the Houston Rockets have won championships. In fact, we've won 2. It's been 30 years, but we've won 2, and so we verify that there are 2 items there. So again, with React testing library, we use find by to wait until we find something that'll be on the page. In this case, we'll wait for the championship info header. That's like an H4 or something. Wait until we visually see that on the page, because that's what the user would see. And then afterwards, we can do normal get by assertions as well. We don't have to keep waiting over and over again. We know the UI has been rendered, and we can test against that. The key here is, though, we're using get all by text, not regular get by text, because we expect multiple to be returned there. So just to quickly go over that again with the queries, we've got 6 different style of queries here. So when we're migrating from Enzyme over to React testing library, we got to realize that we can't just use the one find, there are multiple that we have. So we lose the flexibility of .find and everything that it allows us to do, and we have to learn all these new styles of queries. But the whole point is to avoid testing implementation details there. So, and then sometimes we actually have to go and change our code if our code is not correctly accessible in order to do testing with React testing library. And normally that's a no-no to have to go and change your source code, but it ends up making the source code that the user actually sees more accessible. So it's a win-win for everybody involved. Okay, last one. Let's quickly look at it. So we have a player search component for searching for players. It renders out an input for typing in. Let's say that's another component in our design system. And it also takes in a label for the input field. And then we have a button that you'll click when we search. And then lastly, there's a search function that does the fetch and such. The key here, though, is that it returns a promise, which we'll use in our test, at least in our Enzyme test. So with Enzyme, we can go back to shallow rendering because we're not using use effect here. Again, this is very much like unit testing. To simulate, though, typing, we will invoke the on change of the input component to pass the text that we want. So we never actually even have to run an event. We just invoke that prop, which is very much like unit testing. We don't care how input works. And then we invoke the button. But then, if you remember, we're returning a promise from the fetch, from the search function. So now we can await the on click of the button, so then we know, or we can assume that the promise is over. This is very much an Enzyme style way of testing, if you've ever done that. And now we can go and do the rest of our tests. So this is completely different from our React testing library. Here we actually we simulate the typing, and React testing library is cool is that it will actually do each character really fast, but it'll do each character that way. So it's more like how our user is using it. And then we click the button and we verify everything after that. So the cool thing is that we can find by the label of the input field so that we know that the label and the text field are associated together. Okay, so here are a bunch of resources that I've linked. I aggregated all of the different links that I talked about throughout the whole thing. I really wanted to talk about debugging in React testing library, but I knew I wouldn't have time to do that. So once you get the slides, you can go here and click on all the links there to follow them there. So that's it. I know I flooded you with all kinds of information. Hopefully you found it helpful, you found it insightful. My goal for you was that if you're using Enzyme, that you know that you have to migrate, right? And that you have an idea of what migrating would look like. And if you're already using React testing library, maybe you can reminisce on the past of how Enzyme used to be now, but now you're using React testing library. Or if you've never used Enzyme and only been using RTL, you could get a little history lesson and kind of appreciate some of React testing library's design decisions based upon how other testing used to be there. So I want to give a special shout out quickly to the organizers of React Miami, to G2I and JSWORLD. Can we give them a hand clap for what they're doing, for putting it on? Such a great conference there. And I'll be around after the break, so if you got any questions about Enzyme, React testing library, React, or anything, I'll be out front after all of this. So feel free to grab me whenever, or you can tweet at me, BenMVP, as well. And reminder, the slides I linked it there too. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.